As we speak at the moment, we are going to have a conversation around the xenophobia and the ejection of immigrants from South Africa. And to have this conversation with us is Professor Peter Kagwanja, who is a historian and a professor when it comes to matters to do with foreign policy. Karibu sana.
Asante sana, Dennis.
Yes.
How are you?
Salama sana.
Very good.
Good to see you, Prof. Before we get into the conversation, let's just go to the proverb that we have this morning. And the proverb comes from a country again in South Africa. We are in Lesotho, the country that is known as a kingdom in the sky. Why? Because it is the one country in the world that is over 1,000 meters above sea level. So if you want to experience the snow falling, you just need to go to Lesotho and enjoy that. You talk about the Basotho blanket because it gets really cold. It is part and parcel of the national outlook, their national regalia. There's also that hat that also appears in the that appears in the flag, which is also a national monument, a national symbol for them. But the proverb that we get this morning says, when you want to deal with a problem, you do that early. So let's go to the proverb straight up. You fix a child when they are still young. How would you interpret it? What do you think they are saying?
You fix a child when they are still young.
Yes.
Yeah, it's related to the whole idea of a young tree, which is a very common proverb also within Eastern Africa, where you say you can only shape the tree when it is young. When it's grown, it's firm, and you can't change it much. So it is true that if you want really to make a man out of a child or a woman out of a child, then you have to start nurturing early enough. And it applies to everything in life. If you want to change habits, you don't change them at the late hours of the day. You do that very, very early in the morning.
Very early in the morning. Well said, Prof. But let's jump straight into where we find ourselves today as a continent. A continent with over 54 countries. One of them has said no to the rest of the citizens from the continent, South Africa. It has been touted as xenophobia. This is not the first incident that we see. It happened in 2008. There are three other incidents that have happened before. But where we find ourselves is where many have actually touted it not to be xenophobia, but Afrophobia, the fear of the African people, the black person. And with that, then, one asks the question, Prof, how did we end up here? How has South Africa found itself that it's saying no to its fellow Africans?
It's correct to say that what Africa is experiencing in South Africa is a new version of apartheid. Basically, it's a spin-off of the politics of apartheid, which was itself very xenophobic. Xenophobic in the sense that even the Africans, as Africans, South African blacks are themselves victims of xenophobia, white xenophobia. That's why they were taken to Bantustans and closed in there. And even the question of white settlement in South Africa was xenophobic. They essentially alienated lands and pushed the Africans out of there. So when you're talking about the Xhosa, this is the Mandela community, or the Zulus, most of them have experienced centuries of xenophobic invasion by white people who think that they don't belong there, and therefore they'll be tracked. And there are multiple examples from particularly where the British decided to settle in South Africa, and at that time the dominant people were the Afrikaans, or people of Dutch and continental European origin. The British in Cape Town from the Cape moving inside basically went there through xenophobic movements. And therefore it has always been a white versus black affair. And despite what we are going through, being seen as, African, or what you can call black on black violence, at the heart of it is the racial question. And the beneficiaries of this wave of xenophobia are actually white immigrants. It is not targeting whites. It's essentially targeting blacks. I lived in South Africa, I would say from 2000 all the way up to 2010. But I started moving my family out in 2008 after the xenophobia of that time. Because as a historian and a political scientist, and who was at that time very close to the government of the day of President Thabo Mbeki, I saw it coming. I saw Thabo himself, the president, became a target of xenophobia as the person who was articulating the radical Pan-African opinion, as opposed to Jacob Zuma, who was now on the other side of ethno-nationalism in South Africa. And the 2008, change of guard at that time was underpinned by this, undercurrent of anti-Africa. It is not anti-migration, the way you would argue that you are against immigrants. No, it was outrightly, Afrophobia. And I was at that time executive director at the Human Sciences Research Council. Ironically or paradoxically, the think tank that established apartheid, and which Mandela and Thabo Mbeki had reconfigured now as the institute or a think tank that was now to midwife South Africa's new foreign policy which is pro-African or African-centered. And I could see my colleagues, whites and others, doing research. And even at the level of being an executive director, you'd be sidelined because they want to push a certain agenda. I remember there was one study which was very controversial within the institute in 2008. And even executive, you'd feel that you are being marginalized because the think tank is government funded. And they would argue about how foreigners are basically undermining South Africa. Now, let me give you the context in which you find this xenophobia, the whole policy behind this xenophobia. The idea of apartheid was to make South Africa a white tip of a black continent. And therefore, South Africa must be white. And every policy, largely by Western organizations and think tanks and all, is that South Africa is white. And making South Africa white means weakening African opinion, weakening African population, weakening African business, weakening African, all the pillars or the towering heights of African, presence in South Africa. Whether you're talking about financial, you're talking about education, but more importantly, weakening the demographic power of the African people. Some people have argued, and I don't either agree or disagree, but that even HIV/AIDS, the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in South Africa had much to do with population control at that point. I wouldn't go deeper into that because it requires you to demonstrate. But I want to float that thought because even the leadership of the time, Thabo Mbeki and others, were questioning. Even Wangari Maathai almost lost her Nobel Peace Prize because of that particular opinion. I don't want to lose mine, so allow me not to get deeper into that. But the battle for the demographic power in South Africa is big and has intensified as mainstream white political parties begin to regain the edge that they had lost to the ANC. And it is not a surprise that the new wave, brutal as it is, of xenophobia has come after the 2019 general election. So that provides. Now, before that, becoming South Africa and voting in South Africa was easy because only whites could vote before 1994. I have said again that I and my family, Monica and I, queued and voted for Thabo Mbeki in South Africa. We had arrived in 2000, 2001. We stayed there 2002, 2003. By 2004, we were what do they call green barcode?
Yes,
which is a permanent residency status. We bought our house and settled there in South Africa. Got our jobs at the highest level, in that country as foreigners, and voted for the president and whoever else was in Gauteng province.
Yeah.
Now all that has been reversed by the government.
Yeah.
So in short, South Africa is now very dangerous for black population. And the reason is that you have to control the demographics and the economic power of the black population so that you can create a path for white population to dominate South Africa as a white tip of a black continent.
Yeah, because Prof has just painted a picture of where immigrants like yourself, you were there, you were working, and you had an opportunity to even vote, to cast a ballot and make a decision on who would be leading you.
Yes.
But you find ourselves today where Africans are not needed, especially those they say are illegal immigrants, and many have said it's because they've come here to take our jobs. The immigrants are here, they're driving good cars as we don't have. Is there any credence or truth in that? Or is there hidden messaging that the world is not being told?
If you look at Kenya, which was modeled along the same policies as South Africa, there were certain colonies that were, defined by the British as white man's countries.
Yes.
And these white man's countries were South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. These were white man's country. If you read Daramea's records and you read colonial scholars, white man's countries. And white man's countries simply meant limiting the capacity of the black person to become anything apart from being labor. And only allowing a very few to acquire certain skills, not for their benefit, but the benefit of the white economy. And therefore, when you look at the nature of schooling, can you imagine our first president was trained as a mason, a builder, that's all, and a carpenter, that's all, until he resisted basically and gave himself a different occupation. Many people were trained as as nurses, and so on. So the thrust of the apartheid system, or this so-called white man's countries, was to ensure that there does not arise skilled people who can be economically independent and stand on their feet. Now, that is the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. And now, viewed against the development of other African countries, because South Africa becomes independent after 1994, and even then, unfortunately, the leadership of the period, this was my main criticism of Thabo Mbeki and Nelson Mandela's countries, they did not prioritize what makes a person. They prioritized the body, not the brain. And they prioritized, when they moved to the brain, they didn't want to go to the brain, they went straight to the soul. So it's the clergy who are important. They did not prioritize education the way Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, or the way Jomo Kenyatta did in Kenya, because these are the leaders: Mandela, Kenyatta, and Robert Mugabe. These are three leaders. Mugabe was the most accomplished of all of them, because he saw the liberation of his people in education, not in acquisition of land first. And therefore, when they came to acquiring land, Zimbabweans had moved far and wide into Zambia. Some were here, others were in South Africa, so they advanced. The same came with Samora Machel in Mozambique. And remember, Mozambique, Angola, and other Portuguese colonies were governed with the same principle of just producing a white man's country with the whites as the kitchen in the kitchen or in the farm. They were not in the industry. They were not to be in the economy. And therefore, Samora Machel also moved now to re-educate himself. Remember, he himself, he was trained as a nurse.
Yes.
He was simply a nurse. So you have a president who is not trained in leadership skills. That whatever he had, he trained himself. And he went ahead now to train his people to become everything for his country.
Yeah.
And the result is that South Africa became surrounded by black population that is more educated, that has higher business acumen than the South Africans themselves. And therefore, when the blacks move in, they now are able to occupy. Look at me. Let me give you my example so that you see where we are getting. When I was hired at the Human Sciences, before I was hired in the Human Sciences Research Council, I was working for I was working for a kind of a think tank, which was kind of having an informal relationship with the office of the president, and the purpose was to help establish, the African Union, because at that time Thabo Mbeki was championing, the institutionalization of Pan-Africanism and its transformation economically under the mantra or idea of African Renaissance. So the African Renaissance project, as Mandela and Mbeki's project, was the integration of South Africa to the rest of Africa and the flow of South African capital onto the continent, mining and so on. And at the same time, the bringing of the skills from the continent into South Africa. So I went to South Africa, I traveled from Chicago in the United States of America to South Africa under what they call business visa, to establish NEPAD and the Africa Peer Review Mechanism. That was a visa on my passport, Kenyan passport, issued not in Kenya, but issued in the United States. Chicago. So I landed in Johannesburg as a business expert with a business visa to establish NEPAD, to help establish NEPAD. Now, we rose up the ranks, and by 2007, I was now heading a major institution. But before then, foreign organization, the International Crisis Group, had come, and they are looking around to see whether there's anybody from South Africa they can work with. The only person they could find is myself and others. So many of us as Africans, particularly Kenyans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Zimbabweans, were literally hired by most institutions in South Africa that needed a knowledge base. So it is therefore that I became the executive director of a government think tank that is answerable to Parliament. You know what happened? By 2008, it became impossible for us even to govern. Because I had, South African government had to hire a person who was junior to me to manage me as a manager.
Which doesn't make sense.
No, it didn't make sense. I didn't fight with it because that was not my country. But I read the writings on the wall that I have to go back to my country. Fortunately, that time is when also Kenya needed, its citizen to come back. But to begin to imagine that there is a specific officer, I will not mention his name. We co-authored a book together, which is interesting. We co-authored a book with him, but he was purposely hired to attend meetings that I cannot attend as a non-national, as a non-South African. Not because he's senior to me. He's actually working under me. But there are certain board meetings, certain meetings because of the nature of this think tank that could not allow me to go, for example, to NSAC of the National Security Council and so on. And it's the same case with my wife, who was heading a parallel think tank there, that there is always this other person called the president who now guides the executive. So apartheid was institutionalized within the structures of South Africa, and it is built into that.
Yeah.
So to answer your question straight, there is no substance in what is being said about Africans taking jobs. Actually, they are creating jobs. One of the institutes in South Africa last year, studied, wrote a report on something called Somalinomics. In other words, the economics of Somali people. And because the Somali population that moved from Somalia to South Africa as refugees is now established as one of the mainstream business community. They are simply saying that they are wiping out black entrepreneurs. But there were no black entrepreneurs to start with from the beginning. So again, this is something we need to look at. But I would say all this is fake news, which is peddled through social media, the hate speeches, and misinformation about the Africans in South Africa. But the end game is basically to weaken the demographic power of the black people, both South Africans and Africans, or South Africans of African descent, whether migrants, refugees, or in whichever form they entered the Republic of South Africa.
So, Prof, you've just painted a picture of when what former President Mandela and Mbeki did, and theirs was to integrate South Africa to be united, and as well import what will be skills from the rest of the continent to come and help build the nation. But we also come from the fact that other African nations played refuge to would-be South Africans who were running away from apartheid or the struggle for independence at the time. And with that, Africa helped South Africa be what it is today. And many are saying with that, that South Africa has forgotten who was backing it during the difficult times and are choosing to now rewrite history that does not look really good for them. One asks the question, what does this do to a country that has for a very long time positioned itself as a spokesperson or the big boy, the big man in the room when it comes to African affairs?
You see, I used to publish the flagship publication for South Africa called The State of the Nation. It's a book that would be published every year. It started long before I went there, edited largely by white scholars, Roger Southall and others, very accomplished scholars, and my friends. We have also co-authored books with them. And the State of the Nation, basically, in 2008, which I edited, was very informative of the nature of South African society. South African society, the black population within the ANC, the African Freedom Party, and all these emerging parties in South Africa, which are aligned to the black politics, is a very divided society. And therefore, they have a different perception of Pan-Africanism or African solidarity. Completely different. Now, in that book publication of 2008, we came up with the two concepts that defined the two South Africans, the two black South Africans living side by side in terms of their mentality and perception of the visions of the future of the continent. The first group were the Exiles. And the Exiles now here were signified by Thabo Mbeki. Before that, we had, other people, Oliver Tambo. Nelson Mandela was in that group because he benefited a lot from outside. From the inspiration by the Kenya's Mau Mau movement, connections with Cuba, and Muammar Gaddafi and others who are friends of South Africa. And therefore, South African exiles were part and parcel of the Pan-African opinion, perhaps even the radical wing of the Pan-African opinion. And in that regard, therefore, they stayed in Tanzania, they stayed in Kenya, they stayed in Nigeria, and so on. And these are the people we knew as South Africans. The Nigerians would introduce in their primary schools a shilling for South Africa's freedom. Every child who is paying school fees, you have to contribute a shilling. And so here, we in different ways, we contributed there. And we married their daughters, and they married us. They married. Their daughters married to our sons, and their sons married our daughters as well. So, by the time we are reaching 2008, we have cabinet ministers who are Kenyans. We have vice chancellors in universities who are essentially Kenyans because they spend all their times in Kenya. We have others who are Tanzanians. We have others who are Zambians. So the exiles were basically the face of South Africa to many of us. And therefore we had that solidarity. Until you go inside and now discover another reality. Another thrust of South African population, the larger contingent of that population who are exiles. Exiles as opposed to exiles. The exiles were those who really struggled from within South Africa. And their logic was not essentially to join the rest of Africa. They actually did not even know the rest of Africa. They did not even know the support they were getting from the rest of the continent. They just knew that they were fighting battles with apartheid, with the white racist regime, and therefore they honed their skills about doing that. And they toyed, they banned, they had things they were calling the links, where they would use tires to ban those who are traitors and so forth. So it was black violence violence on what they call black violence on blacks. And the exiles hated immigrants because they believed that they were brought in to take off their jobs. Which is true because during the apartheid period, Mozambicans, Malawians, Zambians were brought by train and to the mines where they were not paid. It is their governments that were paid. So you come to South Africa, you work, but you don't get anything except substance, and then you go back. So the point, therefore, is that you are looking at two South Africa living side by side. One, the exiles, those who knew Africa and shared the vision of Africa. And then the exiles, those who were bred inside and did not even know that. Actually, I had staff in my think tank who would ask me, Professor, when are you going to Africa? I am in South Africa, and they're asking me when I'm going to Africa.
Yeah, Professor, let's take a short commercial break, look at the weather. When you come back, we continue to look at what this really means for South Africa moving forward if they are alienated because there is businesses with other African countries. We've seen that even the artists now being cancelled, businesses are suffering, South African businesses. What does this mean, and where is the position of African Union when it comes to such position that we find ourselves in the continent? You had brought in the dichotomy of exiles and exiles, right? And with that, many are asking, with all that is happening in the country, yesterday we saw the demonstrators who were being escorted by police officers to make sure that there is no illegality. They do not injure, they do not attack these immigrants. But one asks the question, why is the South African government?
I think you need to stay with that dichotomy between the exiles and the exiles. And it is those South Africans who lived on the continent, who worked on the continent, and who made families on the continent, and who were supported by the continent, who have allegiance to the continent. And my argument, in the past and today, was that this group has been increasingly edged out, and they are now kind of confined to certain think tanks in South Africa, and where their influence is not felt. It all started, Mandela was one of the Mandela presidency was largely dominated by the the Exiles. The Mbeki presidency had exiles, but also Mbeki managed to put together a team of serious South Africans who share the Pan-African opinion and who shared the dream of African Renaissance, right? And as a result, then we had that strength. But after 2008, and this is the same date, March 2008, when the first serious wave of xenophobia started. And by the end of that year, around October, there was the Polokwane kind of ANC meeting, which edged Mbeki out of the ANC itself. And eventually, he was marched out of office in a very embarrassing situation, which if Mbeki really reacted as a president, South Africa would not have held together. It would have gone to civil war. But somehow he was sober enough and is a man of conscience. He left the office under that humiliation by these young people who were sent by the ANC to recall the president back to the ANC headquarters. And that, to me, signaled the end of the era of the exiles. And now we begin to see Jacob Zuma, who was the in-between, because he's the person as the chief of intelligence under apartheid, with the ANC under apartheid. He was the one who was moving from inside to outside, and he was the link. And you might see Jacob, or as they call him, Uncle Mzolozi, as a person who is not very clever, but he was one of the most intelligent South Africans, because with the largest experience, and Jacob was himself embedded on the Asian population, particularly the Asian elite, because the Asians were also against apartheid, but they were privileged, just like here in Kenya, they were privileged. So they have their own dynamics of politics. So they are exiles. They are not exiles, but would not mind taking advantage of the exile. Yeah. So when Jacob Zuma came in, then he ushered in the era of exiles. And the rest of the story is very clear. It is the decline of the Pan-Africanism in South Africa. And very, very quickly, they moved to what they call the economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy is basically pushing hard economic interests without caring about the ideological base of Pan-Africanism, because it was very difficult to sell the idea of Africa into South Africa. And of course, the South Africans themselves bought the idea that they are more superior to the rest of the continent because they are in this white tip in a black continent. And that self-consciousness that we're more superior, or that our country is better, the others are what Trump would call whole countries. The essence of it, therefore, is that as we speak, South Africa is going through two transformations. One is the return of apartheid, ideology. Because it's now a power-sharing government between the former apartheid rulers and the exiles. Cyril Ramaphosa essentially was opened to the international community. I worked for Ramaphosa as the executive director of International Crisis Group there, and he was in the executive board. So is this a person I met, and he's thoroughly a Pan-African, although he led the trade union, COSATU. But trade unionism, as you know, would expose people. So Cyril Ramaphosa represented a very special and unique category of South African population that were between the exiles and the exiles. Just because the labor movement, by its very nature, is exposed, and by the very idea of international solidarity of the working class. And he therefore had moved to Geneva, had moved to Africa, and moved to other parts as a Secretary General of COSATU and as a trade unionist. So, but he's one of the very few. And he also does not come from the main communities that produce the bulk of the xenophobes. These are the Zulus and the Xhosas, because these are the communities that really hold key to the politics of that country. And therefore, as we speak, what we are facing is, a black government where the former apartheid sympathizers and the Exiles are now coming together, and both fear the power of a black population that may not support them, because we are not talking about us as Africans. We are talking about us versus them. We as South Africans and them as Makwere. That's what they call us.
Okay.
Those who are in South Africa and are not South Africans are called, whether you have papers or you are a citizen or you are naturalized, it doesn't matter to them. You are a Makwere. In other words, you are speaking in languages that we cannot understand. So the Makwere concept essentially is not a legal concept, is a sociological concept that ensures that you don't belong to South Africa. And when we talk about us versus them in the South African situation, it doesn't matter whether you are there or not. Look at this example of this South African girl, born in South Africa by a South African parent and a Nigerian father. A very beautiful girl, a mixture of two sides of the continent, west and south. And emerges as the top of the picture in the beauty context. And she's basically kicked out of that beauty context. She cannot represent South Africa because she's not South African. So you're not talking about jobs. You're not talking about our jobs. You're not talking about, even when you yourself is a contribution to the diplomacy of South Africa through your beauty, they don't want it. That's how serious this Exile business is, and the rebirth of apartheid in South Africa is. And we are not about to see this changing, because the former apartheid rulers or the generation is deepening in, whether at home or abroad. Look at the backlash that President Cyril Ramaphosa is facing with the United States. Why? It is racist, white racist in the United States. Those who are born and brought up in South Africa, that privilege of apartheid, now who are haunting South Africa from their comfort in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. They feed into another, populist, Donald Trump, that South Africa is basically against whites. So the resurgence of whiteness in South Africa, backed by blackness that was already oppressed and alienated from the rest of the continent, is what is now producing this xenophobia. And we are not about to see it decline. It's not something you can do. The African Union, I would say, and I'm sure this is a debate we can push further, the African Union need to go to the drawing board and see how we are going to bring about the resurgence of Pan-Africanism.
And I think that's where I wanted actually to go next, because if you look at the overall goal of the African Union is a borderless continent, a borderless Africa, where it doesn't matter that I'm a Kenyan. I can go live in South Africa, do business in South Africa, and still come back home, go to Rwanda, go to any other African country, and be seen as an African and not a Kenyan. While being Kenyan is important, we agree, but that would not matter because you are in the continent. I'm going to give you an example of the 27 blocks of the EU. You get this Schengen visa, you can go anywhere, work anywhere, and it is okay. That is what Africa has been pushing for a very long time. Have the African passport. With what we're seeing currently happening in South Africa, does that still remain being a reality? And what must Africa Union and the leaders of African countries do to ensure that Pan-Africanism is entrenched not only on the macro level, but the citizens, the micro level, understand the importance of Pan-Africanism?
First and foremost, we must admit that we are seeing a lot of backpedaling within the government of South Africa. As a result of what we have talked about, a new, evil alliance between the anti-African Exiles and the former ideologues of the apartheid regime. That connection, not necessarily that, but the champions of whiteness in South Africa, the champions of whiteness and the champions of blackness, who see the rest of the continent as the other than being part of the black continent, is now what is shaping South Africa's policy towards Africa. And therefore, now from the African continent, looking at African inside, there are very few people who have undertaken this kind of dichotomy. I personally would not have taken it if I didn't live, in South Africa long enough and at the policy thinking level. If I could not have distinguished what is now happening. But looking at it from that lens, where we are seeing that the coalition that is ruling South Africa only see Africa as an outpost where they can go and invest. That's why their banks, ABSA and others, are coming to the continent. Their security companies like G4S and others are here. Their mining companies are everywhere on the continent, and so on. But they cannot see the connection between what they are doing and the broader, Pan-African agenda of basically empowering the continent as one, uniting the continent along the lines of Kwame Nkrumah's United States of Africa, or Muammar Gaddafi's, Kenyatta's idea that Africa is one. I don't think they think so. For them, they are beneficiaries of white Western capital, which has dominated South Africa. And that capital is the one that is now riding on Pan-Africanism. And it did very well under Thabo Mbeki, because Thabo Mbeki is an economist. Knowingly or unknowingly, he himself became a conduit of white capital from the South African coming to the continent. Here in Kenya, and in many other countries where there was that consciousness, there's a serious backlash against a takeover by South Africa. And that, of course, estranged South Africa and Africa from the fact that we were resisting their investment, which was not investment, it was basically a takeover of businesses. But now when they came in as investments, ABSA and others have found it very easy to operate on the continent, and so to say. South Africa has been the champion. I stated that I want to repeat that. I was hired in South Africa among the many African expats who are now part of my network, from Sierra Leone, from Zambia, from Kenya here, across the continent, Egypt. We were all converged in South Africa, because at that time, only South Africa was investing in the project of Pan-Africanism. And when they were investing in the project of Pan-Africanism, transforming the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, it was not about removing the O in the Organization of African Unity in order to produce African Union. It was a serious ideological agenda, which has now produced what we see today. The African Union, its peace and security architecture, and its larger secretariat, which is basically the most powerful continental government. To be sure, African Union as constituted, if the African leadership takes that seriously, is more powerful than the European Union. European Union is a pale shadow of what we have there in Addis Ababa. It is a problem of commitment of our leadership, particularly on the financial front. I've not seen any African country that has set aside a budget to finance. In other words, when we read our budget, I've never seen any item saying support for our continental government. We have the support for the counties. We have the support for the national government, but not for our continental government. Yet, we are part and parcel of an emerging continental government that is hiring even our top officials. Raila Odinga spent 5 years as a leader of the African Union.
Yes.
And he died fighting to lead the continent on that. Why? Because as Kenyans, we have those 3 tiers. In South Africa, that was there under Mbeki. Now it is not. Therefore, we have this Africa Free Trade Zone,
Free Trade Area.
Yes, area which is the largest, trade area ever
Yes.
In human history, with 54 or 55 countries. If you don't want to, if you want to make Morocco angry, because they don't think Sahrawi is part of that. So, but the African Union has 55 countries. Now, and South Africa is supposed to be part of this and actually a champion of this.
How is what is happening right now then denting South Africa's position in the African Union? Because remember, you've just said that it is an important and serious investor initially, especially when it comes to Pan-Africanism in the African Union. With what we're seeing right now, how is that denting its influence even in the African Union or even in African affairs?
It is seriously, because it is a situation where you wanted to preach water and drink wine. Now, as we speak, the Mozambican leadership is withdrawing its population from South Africa to avoid the deaths that are occurring. On the pipeline now are almost 500 Mozambicans to be ferried back to the country. Kenya is doing the same. Nigeria is doing the same. Ghana is doing the same. African countries, the leading African countries, are basically now repatriating their population from South Africa. In other words, South Africa does not want the input of Africans in their country. Now, how can South Africa now think that it is going to have an input on the continent? And remember, South Africa has been taken by countries like China and other major global powers as the voice of the African continent. For many years, South Africa has represented us in the G20. And very few people have complained. South Africa has represented us in the BRICS, right?
Yes.
We've not complained. South Africa has more than twice represented us in the United Nations Security Council. We've not complained. And South Africa has been a voice in most of these occasions. The leadership around Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa is a credible voice of the continent. In fact, their voice is more credible to us than the voices we have in Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and elsewhere. Particularly when it comes to serious issues affecting humanity, whether you're talking about what is happening in Palestine, what is happening in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. And even the global humanistic opinion, South African leadership and around Ramaphosa. But these are people who are in an enclave, in a country of xenophobes. And these xenophobes are coming in two colors, black xenophobes and xenophobes of whiteness. And the combination of that black and white xenophobia is what is basically the undoing of South Africa when it comes to its interest on the continent. South Africa can never ever become a leading power without riding on the back of South Africa. So I think they need to take a kind of a missionary approach within South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa, and I'm speaking to him, he has basically to take a very serious missionary approach to the Bantustans, to the homelands, to all these slums called Soweto, Kairichia, and so on, and teach South Africans that they are Africans.
Yes.
Now, we don't mind if the African Union can take a kind of a Marshall Plan and then give South Africans from the Bantustans opportunities in our universities in their thousands. Out of the 54 countries, with all the universities we have, within 3 years, we will have produced a South African who is a South African, who is an African.
Yes.
But they need to come and stay with us, like we have stayed with them and come to appreciate them.
That's a very good place to end, that we all must sit together, work together for us to see the Pan-Africanism that we are looking for, and that South Africa must look at its missionary approach and fix the problems that we see today. Professor Peter Kagwanja is the CEO, Africa Policy Institute. Asante, these conversations must continue.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.